I woke up in a filthy government hospital bed, only to realize that, legally, I was already dead. While I spent 6 months fighting for every breath in a coma, my children sold my home, and my best friend moved into my bed. They thought I was a vegetable who couldn't hear their whispers, but I heard everything. They didn't want a miracle. They wanted a funeral. And now that I'm awake, I'm going to become their worst nightmare. The first thing I smelled wasn't medicine or flowers. It was the stench of neglect and bleach. My eyes struggled to open, the fluorescent lights stinging like needles. I wasn't in the private suite my insurance covered. I was in a cramped, 4-person ward with peeling wallpaper and the sound of a leaky faucet. My wife, Sarah, was standing at the foot of the bed, but she wasn't looking at me with love. She was looking at her watch, her face twisted in a mask of pure annoyance. When the doctor told her I was showing signs of brain activity, she didn't cry with joy.
She turned pale. "Is he actually back?" she whispered, her voice trembling not with hope, but with fear.
"We already processed the incapacity papers. This changes everything." Before we dive deeper into how my own blood turned my life into a living hell, make sure to subscribe to the channel. I share stories like this every day, and you won't want to miss how I take my life back from these vultures. My throat felt like it was filled with broken glass. I tried to reach out, to touch her hand, but my muscles were useless weights. I saw Mark, my business partner and the man I called my brother for 30 years, enter the room. He didn't come to my side. He stood behind Sarah and put his hand firmly on the small of her back. The intimacy in that gesture felt like a physical blow to my chest. Mark said, ignoring my flickering eyelids. I lay there, trapped in my own skin, listening to the two people I trusted most, discussing me like a piece of trash they forgot to take out. They had moved me to this dump to save money for their vacations. They weren't waiting for me to wake up. They were just waiting for the heart monitor to flatline. But I'm still here, and I remember everything. The discharge day was supposed to be a celebration of life, but for me, it felt like being escorted to my own execution. I was slumped in a wheelchair, my body still weak, pretending that my mind was as foggy as they hoped.
Sarah didn't drive me to the beautiful 4-bedroom colonial house we had shared for 25 years. Instead, she pulled up to a gray, cramped apartment complex on the outskirts of town. I tried to slur, my voice sounding like gravel. Sarah didn't even look at me. She was too busy texting on her gold-plated phone, a phone I knew I hadn't bought her. She lied without blinking. I knew for a fact my insurance was top tier. As she pushed my wheelchair through the narrow hallway of the apartment, the smell of stale cigarettes and cheap carpet hit me. This wasn't a home. It was a holding cell. I looked around the living room and saw a few boxes. My heart sank. These were the only remnants of my life. My collection of vintage watches? Gone. My custom golf clubs? Nowhere to be seen. Even my father's old leather armchair was missing. "Where is all our furniture, Sarah? The oak table? My desk?" I asked, keeping my gaze vacant. She sighed, an exaggerated sound of a woman burdened by a useless husband.
"Sold, Harry. Everything had to go to pay for your care. You should be grateful we found this place." I looked out the window and saw a neighbor walking by. He looked at me with pity, then looked at the sleek, brand-new SUV Sarah had parked out front. It was a luxury model, worth at least $80,000. They had sold my sanctuary, the place I worked 30 years to build, just so they could live like royalty while I rotted in a state ward. Every memory of my children growing up in that house was traded for leather seats and a shiny engine. My blood boiled, but I kept my face frozen in a blank stare. The game had truly begun. The door to the apartment clicked open, and in walked Mark. He didn't knock. He didn't ask for permission. He walked in like he owned the air I was breathing. He was wearing one of my expensive Italian silk shirts, one I had bought for my 60th birthday. Seeing it on his shoulders made my skin crawl. "How's the patient doing today?" Mark asked, his voice dripping with fake concern. He walked right over to Sarah and kissed her deeply, right in front of me. They didn't even wait for me to look away. They knew I was watching, but to them, I was just a piece of broken furniture, a ghost that still took up space. Sarah replied, leaning into him. Mark laughed and pulled a bottle of expensive scotch from the cabinet. My scotch. They sat on the sofa just a few feet away from my wheelchair, sipping my drinks and discussing their future. They talked about moving to a villa in Spain once the settled. Mark complained about how hard it was to manage my accounts, but then joked about how easy it was to convince the bank I was incompetent. Mark chuckled, clinking his glass against Sarah's. But then I remembered how much he used to brag about his hard work. "Well, Harry, your hard work is finally paying off for people who actually know how to enjoy it." I kept my mouth shut. I let a little bit of drool escape the corner of my mouth, looking as pathetic as possible. Inside, I was memorizing every word, every boastful confession. I wasn't just a third wheel in my own life. I was a fly on the wall, and I was starting to realize that my quote 15 hadn't just stepped in when I fell into a coma. He had been waiting for me to fall his entire life. If I thought the betrayal of my wife and friend was the peak of my pain, I was wrong. The true heartbreak came when my children walked through the door. My son David and my daughter Chloe didn't rush to hug me. They didn't even ask how my physical therapy was going. They walked past my wheelchair as if I were a coat rack. "Mom, we need more," Chloe said, tossing her designer handbag onto the kitchen counter. "The payments on the Porsche are insane, and the insurance went up because of that speeding ticket in Vegas. You said Dad's retirement fund was huge." Sarah looked stressed, rubbing her temples. "Chloe, I've already transferred $80,000 to your accounts this month. We have to be careful. If the auditors see too much movement before the final incapacity hearing, it'll look suspicious." David, my oldest, paced the room with an entitled scowl. "Careful? Look at him, Mom. He's gone. He's just staring at the wall. He doesn't need a retirement fund. He needs a diaper and a TV. Why should his money sit in a bank while we're struggling to maintain our lifestyle?" Struggling? I had paid for their private universities, bought them their first homes, and given them everything. Now, they were standing 5 feet away from me, debating how much more they could bleed out of my 401k. "Dad used to be so stingy with the business profits," David continued, laughing as he grabbed a beer from the fridge. "Remember how he made us work those summer shifts at the warehouse? Payback is a beautiful thing. I'm thinking of taking the boat out this weekend. Oh wait, I forgot. Mark and I sold the boat last Tuesday." They laughed together, a cold, sharp sound that echoed in the small apartment. Chloe walked over and patted my shoulder, but it wasn't a gesture of affection. She whispered in my ear, her breath smelling of expensive perfume. I sat there, my hands trembling slightly under the blanket. Not from weakness, but from a cold, calculated rage. My own children saw me as an ATM that had finally broken open. They weren't mourning their father. They were looting a corpse. That was the moment I realized I didn't have to feel guilty about what I was going to do next. To them, I was already dead. Fine, I would be the ghost that haunts them. The turning point happened late on a Tuesday night. Sarah and Mark had gone out to a quote 24, leaving me alone in the dark apartment. They didn't even bother to leave a light on for me. To them, darkness was enough for an object. But as soon as I heard the roar of the SUV fading into the distance, I moved. My legs were weak, and my joints screamed in protest. But I dragged myself out of that wheelchair. I crawled toward the small storage closet, where Sarah had shoved the useless boxes from our old house. My breath was ragged, and sweat poured down my face. But I found what I was looking for: My old laptop.
They hadn't sold it because the screen was cracked, thinking it was trash. They were wrong. I hid under the glow of the screen in the corner of the kitchen. With trembling fingers, I logged into my secondary bank accounts, the ones I had kept for business emergencies, the ones Sarah didn't know existed. My heart skipped a beat. They hadn't found these yet. But as I dug deeper into the shared accounts, I found the digital trail of their betrayal. There were scanned copies of documents I had never seen. I saw my signature, clumsy, shaky, and clearly forged, on a power of attorney form. Then, I found the medical report. It was signed by a Dr. Sterling. The report claimed I had, quote, 27, quote. I remembered that name. Sterling was a college friend of Mark's. They hadn't just gotten lucky, they had planned this. They had legally buried me alive. I found emails between Sarah and the realtor. They had sold my family home for 20% below market value just to get a quick cash payout. They were burning through my life's work like it was scrap paper. But the most damning evidence was a folder labeled Reorg. Mark was planning to dissolve our partnership and move all assets to a new entity under his name only, leaving even Sarah with nothing but the debt. I heard a car door slam outside. I quickly shut the laptop, shoved it back into the box, and scrambled back into my wheelchair. I resumed my vegetable pose just as the door handle turned. Sarah walked in, smelling of wine and expensive cigars. She didn't even look at me. She just walked past and muttered, quote, 30, quote. She had no idea that the ghost had just found the nails for her coffin. Living as a, quote, 31 in the corner of the room was the hardest part of my plan, but it gave me the ultimate advantage, invisibility. Over the next 2 weeks, I became a master of my own shadow. While Sarah and Mark lounged on the sofa, discussing their greed, I was recording everything. I had managed to hide a small, voice-activated recorder, which I'd recovered from my old office box, inside the lining of my wheelchair. Every morning, Sarah would, quote, 32 me, shoving a spoon into my mouth while staring at her reflection in the hallway mirror. Quote, 33, she'd sneer, wiping a spill from my chin with a rough paper towel. The she referred to was actually her spending my money. One afternoon, I heard her and Mark arguing in the kitchen. They didn't even lower their voices. "The doctor is getting nervous, Mark," Sarah hissed. "Sterling says if an independent auditor looks at Harry's files, he'll lose his license. We need to finalize the business transfer now." Mark's voice was calm, almost chilling. "Don't worry about Sterling. I paid him enough to keep his mouth shut for a decade. Once Harry signs the final papers with the X next week, he becomes a ward of the state. We'll move him to that facility upstate, and we can finally leave this dump." "And the kids?" Sarah asked. Mark let out a short, dry laugh. "They've had their fun. Once the business is in my name, I'll cut them off. They're leeches, Sarah, just like their father was." I sat there, staring blankly at a spot on the wall, while my recorder captured every single word. I had them. I had the forgery, the bribery of a medical professional, and the conspiracy to commit fraud. They were so confident in my brain death that they were handing me the keys to their prison cells. My body was getting stronger every day from the secret exercises I did at night, but my heart was becoming a stone. I wasn't just waiting to wake up anymore. I was waiting to strike. The betrayal reached a new level of depravity a few days later. I was, quote, 42 in my chair when Mark took a private call in the hallway, thinking I was asleep. He didn't realize I had tucked my smartphone, which I'd recovered from a hidden compartment in my old briefcase, under my thigh, recording every word. "Listen, baby," Mark whispered into the phone, his voice thick with a different kind of affection than he showed Sarah. "Just hold on for one more week. Once the ghost signs over the business, I'm liquidating everything. Sarah thinks we're moving to Spain together. She has no idea I've already set up a shell company in the Caymans. I'm leaving her with the empty apartment and the legal mess.
She's too greedy to see it coming. I felt a strange shiver of cold satisfaction. Mark wasn't just a traitor to me. He was a predator who was about to devour the very woman who had helped him destroy me. Sarah had traded her husband's life for a man who viewed her as nothing more than a temporary accomplice. Later that evening, the quote 45 began. Sarah, Mark, and my children gathered in the small living room. They opened a bottle of vintage wine I had been saving for my retirement. My daughter, Chloe, was scrolling through a luxury real estate site. Sarah said, glancing at me with a look of pure disgust. David laughed, tossing a grape at me. It hit my forehead and rolled onto the floor. Mark replied, clinking his glass against David's. They toasted to my demise right in front of me. I watched them through half-closed eyes, recording their laughter, their admissions of fraud, and Mark's secret plans.
They were walking into a trap of their own making, and the best part was, they were the ones who had built the walls. I was no longer just a victim. I was the architect of their ruin. The night before the final signing was the quietest night of my life. The apartment was filled with a thick, suffocating tension. Sarah and Mark were in the kitchen, frantically checking documents and whispering. They looked like bank robbers preparing for a heist, not a family caring for a sick relative.
"Everything is ready," Sarah said, her voice shaking with a mix of greed and nerves. "The notary is coming at 10 in the morning. Sterling sent over the updated medical certificate. It states Harry has the mental capacity of a 4-year-old, just enough to be guided by his legal guardians." Mark grinned, checking his watch. "Perfect. I've already prepped the transfer wire. As soon as that ink is dry, the business assets move. By noon, Harry is officially a ward of the state, and we're on our way to the airport. I've booked the tickets, Sarah, just like we planned." I watched them from the shadows of the living room. Sarah didn't know that Mark's were only for himself and his secret mistress. She didn't know that the transfer wire was going to a hidden account she couldn't touch. She was so focused on burying me that she couldn't see the hole Mark was digging for her right under her feet. My children stopped by one last time to say goodbye. David didn't even look at me. He was too busy talking about the yacht he wanted to rent. Chloe looked at me for a brief second, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of guilt. But then she reached into my bowl of fruit, took the last apple, and laughed. They left, laughing and dreaming of the millions they hadn't earned. I sat in the dark for hours, waiting for Sarah and Mark to fall asleep. When the apartment finally went silent, I stood up. My legs felt strong. I spent the night finishing my final digital backup and sending a very long, very detailed email to a federal prosecutor I used to do business with. I wasn't just Harry the victim anymore. I was the storm that was about to break their world apart. Tomorrow, the ghost was going to speak. The morning of my, quote, 60 arrived with a cold, gray light. The small apartment was crowded. Sarah was wearing a bright red dress, looking more like a bride than a wife about to commit her husband to a facility. Mark was there, suit sharp, briefcase open. My children stood in the corner, checking their phones, bored by the formality of destroying their father's life. Even the notary and the corrupt Dr. Sterling were present, looking impatient. Mark said, sliding a thick stack of papers onto the table in front of my wheelchair. He placed a pen in my limp hand. Sarah leaned in close, her voice a poisonous honey. I looked down at the paper. It was the total surrender of my business, my remaining savings, and my dignity. The room went silent, everyone holding their breath, waiting for the quote 64 to comply. Instead of making a mark, I dropped the pen. It clattered loudly on the floor. I slowly straightened my back. My spine popped, and the vacant stare in my eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, razor-sharp focus. I looked Mark directly in the eye and spoke in a voice that was calm, deep, and perfectly clear. The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah's glass of water slipped from her hand, shattering on the tile. Mark stepped back, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. Sarah gasped, her voice cracking. I said, pulling the device from my wheelchair and placing it on the table. I pressed play. The room was filled with the sound of Mark laughing about the Dubai trip, the children calling me a leech, and Mark's secret plan to abandon Sarah. As the recording played,
The door to the apartment was kicked open. 2 federal agents and the local police stepped in. I had sent them everything last night, the bank transfers, the emails, and the audio. I said, standing up from the wheelchair without any help. The screaming started then, Sarah accusing Mark, Mark trying to bolt for the door, and my children crying as they realized the Porsche was going back to the dealership. I simply walked past them, out into the fresh air, leaving the wreckage of their greed behind. For the first time in 6 months, I could finally breathe. The trial was short, but the fallout was permanent. With the evidence I gathered, the court annulled every single document they had forced me to. Mark and Dr. Sterling are currently serving long sentences for fraud and racketeering. Sarah, caught in the middle of the conspiracy, lost everything: the apartment, the cars, and the quote 72 who was planning to dump her anyway. My children? They learned the hard way that an inheritance isn't a right, it's a gift. When the luxury cars were repossessed and the bank accounts frozen, they finally realized that the man they called an object was the only thing keeping them afloat. I haven't spoken to them since the day in court. Some betrayals are too deep for an apology to reach. As for me, I didn't stay to watch them crumble. I sold the remains of my business to a competitor for a price that ensured I'd never have to work another day in my life. I didn't want the old house back either. It was filled with too many ghosts of the people I thought I loved. Instead, I bought a small, whitewashed villa on a quiet tropical island. Now, my mornings don't start with the smell of hospital bleach or the sound of whispers behind my back. They start with the sound of the ocean and the taste of fresh coffee. I spend my days swimming, reading, and actually living, not just surviving. My health has returned, and my mind is sharper than ever. I've started a small foundation to help elderly people who are victims of financial abuse. It's funny. They thought they were stealing my future, but all they did was clear the path for a better one. I'm 61, and for the first time in my life, I'm not the provider or the partner. I'm just Harry. And Harry is doing just fine. Looking back, I wonder if I was too cold. I watched my own family plot my demise for weeks while I sat in silence. I recorded my children's greed and used it to strip them of their comfort. So I have to ask you, did I do the right thing by playing the ghost to catch them, or did I go too far? What would you have done if you woke up and realized your entire life had been looted by the people you loved most? If you enjoyed this story of justice and revenge, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another incredible story. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I read every single one of them. The end. Thank you for listening.